Welcome, everyone. We hope you're off to a great start to your Denver Democracy Summit. My name is Cullen Hendrix, and I'm a professor here at the Korbel School, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. My co-host today is Professor Jonathan Moyer, who is also the director of the Pardee Center for International Futures here at the Korbel School. The Pardee Center's mission is to explore and understand, and in fact shape actively, alternative futures for global change and human development through medium and long-range integrated assessment analysis. Today, we're going to be talking about the role of surveillance in society, and in particular, how the COVID pandemic has recharged fundamental debates about the tensions between effectively monitoring threats to public safety and the threats these same technologies pose to individual freedoms and privacy. The September 11th terror attacks, along with similar attacks in Madrid and the United Kingdom, led to massive changes in the ways and the depths to which democratic governments surveil their societies. Recent technological advances in AI, image recognition, and the ubiquity of GPS-enabled devices, coupled with the urgency of the COVID pandemic, have reshaped and expanded these efforts. In doing so, they've raised a host of thorny issues about whether and how these technologies may pose threats to democracy. Joining us today to offer insights are our two esteemed panelists, Dr. Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Jennifer Williams. Dr. Greitens is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, an adjunct fellow with the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard, and a member of the Digital Freedom Forum at the Center for New American Security. Her work broadly focuses on US national security and foreign policy, with specific expertise in East Asia, as well as authoritarian politics. Her first book, Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence, received the 2017 Best Book Award from both the International Studies Association and the Comparative Democratization section of the American Political Science Association. Jennifer Williams is Senior Foreign Editor at Vox and co-host of the Worldly Podcast, a weekly news podcast highlighting the one thing you need to understand to make sense of the world around you. Before joining Vox, Ms. Williams was a senior researcher at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings and the Deputy Foreign Policy Editor for Lawfare. Her work on jihadist groups, terrorism, and the Middle East has appeared in numerous publications, from foreign affairs to foreign policy and the national interest. And we are very, very, very proud to say that she earned her MA in International Studies right here at the Korbel School, where she was a C Fellow at the C. Chao Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy. Thank you so much for joining us, Sheena and Jennifer. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get to it. Jonathan and I will be asking several questions to kickstart the conversation, and we'll welcome questions from Democracy Summiteers as well. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask our esteemed panelists. And please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to just as many of them as we can. So, in countries from China to Israel and Italy, governments are making extensive use of a variety of surveillance techniques, ranging from camera footage to cell phone tracking and credit and debit card tracking to assess mobility, monitor potential spread, and facilitate contact tracing. All of this has been in the service of responding to the pandemic. But are there potential dangers here? What are the potential dangers to democracy that come with the increased use of these technologies? Sheena, we'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much to everyone for joining the webinar today. It's really terrific to be part of this conversation for what I think is really a defining issue for the time that we're in. So as we think about what the pandemic's effect on the use of surveillance has been, what the long-term trends are, and what we should be concerned about, particularly in terms of risks to democracy, I want to start with China. And I want to start with China because that is a place where it was the initial epicenter of the novel coronavirus outbreak. And it is a place where the initial pandemic response was something that the world paid a lot of attention to. And in China, what we see is that the response to the pandemic really drew on a surveillance system and a system for surveillance and social control that China had already been working to strengthen for years prior to that. Starting even before Xi Jinping, but especially emphasized under his tenure, the party and the party state have sought to build what they call a multidimensional information-based system of prevention and control for social stability. That's as much a mouthful in English as it is in the original Chinese, I promise. But the point here is that it's a very, very complex integrated system of surveillance technology that not only collects a lot of data, but then integrates it on the backside and then tries to deploy and use that information for governance purposes. So when the pandemic happened, China had already been looking very seriously at how to collect and integrate information for surveillance purposes. So the effect of the pandemic was really both to draw on that system, right? So you had, the frontline grid managers and the frontline workers in China who provide that information now getting an added task of monitoring and reporting into the system on public health. But it also then strengthened and expanded the system because you see that private companies developed specific health tracking codes and a way to collect new data and expanded forms of data that were then passed over to the public security department. So it's really important to understand that China's approach to pandemic management really was tied in very heavily with and depended on a system of surveillance that had been constructed beforehand. And it strengthened and expanded that system. But that's relevant because China has then sought to go out and say that this is a model of pandemic management that can be used all over the world. And there are some real risks to that approach. My co-author, Julian Gewertz, who has since joined the National Security Council, and I wrote in a piece last summer that we were concerned that because of China's global position and its willingness to export this technology to a lot of places, that this really could represent a significant expansion in the use of Chinese surveillance technology globally. That's actually what happened after the Beijing Olympics, when China's use of initial sort of much earlier forms of surveillance technology were put on display at the Beijing Olympics. People looked at how useful they were for event management and public safety writ large, and those systems started to spread across the world. I've done some research for the Brookings Institution where we track the export of those systems to over 80 countries already before the pandemic ever happened, right? And so the potential is that there are already these supply chains and relationships in place to really expand that surveillance to health surveillance. The big question is there a way for democracies to put technical and legal safeguards around the use of surveillance to make it effective for protecting public health and guard against some of the risks that it will damage and hurt democracy? And we've seen, that the expansion of Chinese surveillance technologies and products in other places has been used to track political opponents, degrade democracy and civil liberties around the world. But there have also been cases like Taiwan and South Korea where the countries, particularly those that have experience with a previous infectious disease outbreak, have managed to think about and put some firewalls around the use of health surveillance to make it a little bit more compatible with democracy. I won't go into a ton of detail about that now, but I hope that's a question we can come back to. Like, what does a democracy compatible model look like in this day and age? And so, I think as we look at this, there is a real risk that this surveillance technology, which is already spreading, is going to continue to spread or spread at a higher rate with even fewer safeguards now in under a state of emergency or a public health crisis. But then that those tools will be really difficult to roll back as the health crisis subsides. That's what we saw, for example, after 9/11, Cullen, as you mentioned, right? That these tools that were passed in a crisis setting can be really difficult to take away after the fact. So again, I think we have some options for how democracies can do that maybe we can explore a little bit later in the panel. But that's sort of how I see the lay of the land on surveillance today and the risk that it poses to democracy.
Thank you so much. That's a great introduction to this discussion. Jen, I'm curious about your thoughts on this because, via your work on terrorism, I suspect you're kind of a veteran of how this debate has evolved over the last couple of decades. So would love to hear what you think.
Sure. Yeah. And Sheena, that was a great introduction. Fantastic look, especially inside China, which is obviously the big model that a lot of people are looking at right now for how this works. So we've heard a lot of these conversations lately about how we need to kind of treat pandemic disease as a national security threat, right? There's been kind of a lot of, these aren't new calls, first of all, these are renewed calls, right? We've heard this before. National security strategies of presidents past have elevated pandemic disease to the level of a national security threat. But given that we're living through a really horrific pandemic in something, ways that we've never seen before in our lifetimes, there are renewed calls for this. And I think it's important to look at it in a security context, but it's also really important to look at what that could do in the negative sense and what it means to securitize public health. So I think, going back to the 9/11 model, if you think about, after 9/11, the expansion of the security state, right? The Patriot Act, right? You had increased abilities for the government to surveil citizens, non-citizens alike, massive kind of gathering up of data. And, it was all done essentially in the name of national security, right? This was something that you were essentially giving up parts of your freedom, parts of your liberties, with the understanding that it will help keep you safe. At least that was the bargain that, ostensibly you were being sold, right? And to me, when I think about when the Patriot Act was passed, when it's being discussed, and we were talking about, right after 9/11, it kind of seems quaint now almost. If you think about it, do you remember the conversations about what if they can pull your library records? That was, a huge issue with that, oh my gosh, the government would be able to secretly pull records of what books you checked out of the library. I still think that's a bad thing, that government probably shouldn't be able to do that. But it feels today quaint when we're now sitting here talking about, geolocation on your phone and the ability potentially of massive private corporations, but also governments, to be able to know in real time, name, health information, where you are in relation to other people, what people you've come into contact with, in addition to spending, purchasing patterns, all of your reading choices, what you watch on Netflix. It's such a massive picture of data that we have now. And I think it's important to think about what that means when we start looking at this data collection, particularly on like COVID contact tracing apps and things like that. And what that means when we start thinking about, you're selling this also as in a very similar way in 9/11 of saying, look, you need to download these apps. They're really important for public health, for communications purposes, right? And so as a citizen, you're, thinking, okay, well, that makes sense, right? I'm not going to commit any crimes. I just want to know if I was exposed when I went to CVS. And that makes sense. The question becomes, what happens to that data after the pandemic? What happens during, but also after? Where does that data go? Does it stay on your phone? Does it stay in someone else's server? Who has access to that data? Is it deleted? How long, is it kept on the server? How much of that information is anonymized, or can it actually, find your home address and your name and who you met with? And you have really serious concerns, obviously, around freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, organizing, the ability to, go to a protest and, not have that fact be necessarily known retroactively that you were there 6 months later, right? I think looking at Hong Kong in particular is a really useful model here. When you're thinking as a citizen, of course, I'm not going to commit a crime. It's a pandemic. I'm fine. I'm sure plenty of people in Hong Kong thought that. And then, the law changed, and overnight, literally, Beijing passed the national security law, and basic, expressions of speech and, protest were, made illegal literally overnight. And so it went, all of a sudden now they have all this information, and they are now, as we speak, detaining, prosecuting, imprisoning people for, things that they did in the past for being involved in protests. And so when you think about, okay, well, what happens in the future? Yes, I have this app on my phone today, but 6 months from now, a year from now, will that information still be available? Who gets to see it? And I think, for me there, and this is something I definitely want to get into a bit more later, we can chat about it. For me, as a journalist, there are really serious concerns, in particular in terms of being able to figure out who I talk to and who I meet with, right? So if you think about, a COVID tracing app, it's one thing to get, a ping on your phone that says you have been exposed potentially, and it's being used to track a virus. Well, what happens if it's being used to track the dissemination of information? What if it says you have been in contact with someone who has classified information? Please alert the authorities if you have met with this person or you will be arrested, right? So what if we're not tracking viruses? What if we're tracking people? And that's when you really start to think like, they literally, if there's a security agency that is worried about a classified leak, can they see, who I as a journalist may have met with? Was my Bluetooth pinging off of other people's phones? Can they compare those codes to that person's phone and find out who was their leaker? There are very direct, specific potential consequences to this. And I think, one of the most important things to do is to have these conversations now, because this is all going so quickly. After 9/11, it also happened very quickly. And we ended up still to this day trying to figure out how to kind of retroactively, legislate and, rein it back in. Things are going so much even faster now because it's literally moving at the pace of viral disease. And, not as much necessarily care and caution is being put in on the front end, because it's just like, get the apps out there, get on the phone. We need to figure out, who has this, who has the best model, go, go, go. And then all of a sudden, once it's on people's phones, they're like, oh, sorry, turns out we exposed all of your information to literally everyone on the internet. Oopsie. And now that information's out there. So I think it's important to have those conversations now in the moment so that we don't, 5 years from now go, oh, we just created a monster and we don't know what to do with it.
Thanks.
I think, go ahead, Cullen, sorry.
I was just going to say, thank you, Jen. That's fascinating.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think both of your introductory comments have been really interesting and important right now. We have 2 more questions for the panel, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. The first question, and Jenna, I'll put it back to you first, and then over to Sheena after. So far, we've been focusing on government surveillance, but of course, that's not the only way technology is reshaping these conversations. Social media has definitely had an impact on COVID response, especially in relation to disinformation. Earlier speakers in the Democracy Summit talked quite a bit about disinformation and its role vis-a-vis democratization. So disinformation has shaped how we think about the origins of the pandemic, the severity, and even about the vaccines being rolled out to combat it. How can or how should democracies go about balancing issues related to freedom of speech with public safety and health concerns? So Jen, over to you for a first kind of set of comments, and then over to Sheena after.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something I think about a lot working in the media of, how do we do, responsible public health messaging while at the same time, not, restricting freedom of speech, freedom of expression. When there's a pandemic like we're in now, having accurate, scientifically based, vetted, serious, cautious information is literally a matter of life and death, right? It is important that you know which treatments are and are not safe, how safe a vaccine is, how, what's the data from the phase 3 trials, right? You need to have accurate information. And so of course, there's a natural tendency, there's a natural impulse to want to, make sure that people are not spreading dangerous disinformation, right? To monitor that kind of information, to make sure that if people are presenting, lies, conspiracy theories about safety of vaccines, for instance, or, promoting unproven cures that could potentially be deadly if people try them at home, right? There's a natural impulse to want to control that information, to take it down, to regulate it. The problem is, for me, where you draw the line, right? And who is drawing that line also. I think those are 2 kind of really critical factors here. So, where do you draw the line, for instance, between legitimate questioning of the safety effectiveness of a vaccine versus being, promoting anti-vaxxer kind of conspiracy theories, right? And who's deciding that? So I think a good example to look at, if you think about it, the US case versus the China vaccine case, right? So in September, the New York Times reported that China had already been inoculating thousands of workers that they considered essential with what was essentially an unproven vaccine at that point. Several of them, in fact. The vaccines were still in phase 3 trials. They were still pretty early in their phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials for people who, I mean, we're all experts in, pandemic and in vaccinations now, right? But these are the big, large scale trials that are really kind of testing a broader swath of the population. It's really critical information. They were, the Chinese government was already getting these out and essentially hoping, crossing their fingers and hoping that one of those or all of them would prove to be safe and effective. Now, if you're a worker in China who maybe was not thinking that was the best thing that was going on, maybe I've got some questions about, how they're doing this, and maybe I want to speak up about it. Or maybe I've gotten the vaccine and I'm experiencing some really strange side effects, and I want to put that on Weibo. I want to discuss that on social media. Now, if I'm the Chinese government and I don't want information getting out there that says, I may have just, given my people a dangerous vaccine, right? Do you take that information down? And where's that line there between, countering dangerous public health messaging versus actually taking down, legitimate questioning? And so, again, who gets to do that? In the US, obviously, the government doesn't control social media as much as they probably wish that they could. And they do. But, you have private companies, you have Twitter and Facebook being the arbiters of this information. And so even there, you also have this, is Twitter going to hire, public health? They have doctors, right? Vaccination experts. Who gets to decide, is this someone who's legitimately questioning, I'm not sure how safe this is, or what do we know about this? Or I'm not convinced that this is the most effective thing. And do you take that down because it is potentially promoting disinformation? And figuring out, that scale, we tend to kind of, lag behind, and then all of a sudden there's this like overreach and we start taking down everything. It's like, whoa. People are trying to have legitimate conversations here. And, for me, as someone who, and I'm sure the rest of the audience and the panel all agree, I'm someone who very much believes that people should have access to information and that should be largely unfettered, and that, debate in the public square should be how that is, arbitrated, and how the best ideas are the ones that survive arguments, right? The question is, when it becomes so polluted with disinformation that's not even possible. So you have to find that kind of middle ground. And I think we haven't hit that sweet spot yet, and it's becoming increasingly problematic in the middle of a, public health pandemic.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jennifer. Sheena, how do you think about this? I mean, where do we draw the line? Who draws the line? What does your research say about this question?
Yeah, I mean, in the environments I work on, the government takes a lot of prerogatives on itself to be able to suppress information that is unfavorable to the government, right? So when you work on China, you're working on a system where national security is defined in terms of what the regime calls political security, which is about defending the leadership of the Communist Party, the socialist system, and the authority of the Central Committee with Xi Jinping as the core. That's the sort of classic formulation of what political security means. And so there isn't the sort of same idea or question over who gets to determine what information is in the sort of the people's interest, right? The party speaks for the people, even though it's only about 15%, 15 to 20% of China's population, right? It's a people's democratic dictatorship, to use the throwback term. And so ultimately the party directs the state in terms of what information should be made available in the quote unquote, the people's interest. So the question of who gets to make the decision is defined very, very differently in an autocracy, right? And I think that's one of the fundamental separating lines in terms of how we think about democracy and autocracy today is, who gets to make these decisions about information. The problem, of course, is that, democracy is messy, democracy is hard, and free speech includes the right to be wrong. And the line between the right to be wrong and the right to spread wrong information that might impact other people is, as Jen said, a really, really tricky one, right? there's the old saying that your right to swing your arm stops at somebody else's face, right? As the parent of small boys, I understand this pretty well, right? Like you can do a lot of things except when it hurts someone else. And the issue with disinformation is then figuring out what that line is where your right to express ends up having negative impacts on somebody else. And so I think there does, this is a really difficult question. I don't know that I have any easy answers because, like I said, the systems that I principally work on and study operate very differently. And so when I comment on this in like the United States, I'm commenting more as a citizen and hopefully a relatively informed one than I am as an expert. I guess the only thing that, that I'll say is that, I think there's a related question with disinformation about trust and expertise. And that ideally we would have a system where, over time, the noise and the signal are separable in terms of the quality of information. And so I think that, the role of experts and expert institutions and by that I mean like public health bodies, university researchers, scholarship that's peer reviewed, that, trials that go through external review and pre-review before certain experiments are done, right? That expertise exists for a reason, and it exists in part to vet the information that gets out there to make sure that it's considered credible by a community that has the expertise to evaluate it, right? I grew up in a family with two parents who are doctors. I'm very aware that my Googling things is not equivalent to an MD. But that also puts a real burden on experts in this day and age where, people who do public health have social media accounts. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish as from a layperson's perspective, is this person giving their opinion as an expert based on research, based on data that they've tested, that's been reviewed, that is their best expert judgment of what is in the public interest? Or is this somebody's private opinion? And social media can really conflate those two. And I actually think, it's something I've thought a lot about as somebody who claims to occasionally wear the expert hat on issues like surveillance in China, trying to keep those lanes clear. Right, in order to try to do the thing that I can control, which is to make clear when I'm giving you my personal opinion and when I'm giving you the conclusions of research that's peer reviewed and credible because of the process that's gone through to generate it. That's not a solution, right? I'm not saying that this is in any way the responsibility of experts or that it can be fixed by taking those steps. But I do think it's an interesting and important dimension of this, because part of what can combat disinformation or misinformation just at a sort of everyday level is for people to understand which sources are credible and which ones are not backed by evidence that's been sort of adjudicated and actually and that is in some cases real, right? You also have just outright fabrication of information. Sometimes sponsored by state affiliated actors. And that's kind of a separate problem, I think, in some ways than the problem of sort of everyday misinformation floating around. And so I think we probably need to start disaggregating these different information problems to figure out how to more effectively deal with them. I realize that's not much of an answer, in part because I think these are such difficult challenges for democracy.
No, it's certainly not a panacea, but I mean, it does provide some guardrails and guidance as to the kinds of questions we should be asking. And then I really like how the conversations move towards almost a discussion of authoritarianism versus democracy and how we think about expertise and how we think about validating expert opinions, which would be a fascinating conversation. The last question we have for our panelists, and I'd like to start with Sheena if possible with this, and it's thinking about the future of these relationships. So development and change in aspects of technology and governance is rapid and very unpredictable. It makes it very difficult to assess trends across time and think about the long-term future of the relationships that we're discussing here. In the recent past, technologies have been expanding its ability to track and monitor all types of human behavior, while democracies experience challenges and erosions in particular cases and settings. With this in mind, what kinds of conversations do you think we're likely to have about this topic in 5, 10, and 20 years? Does this democracy compatible model that you talked about earlier, does it is there light at the end of the tunnel for it? So I find this to be also one of these areas where there's no clear, definitive answer, but I'm really curious to hear both of your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think a couple of themes are really important. I mean, first of all, right now we're living in an age of democratic backsliding and of some re-autocratization, right? And so I think that's an important global trend to keep in mind is that this is an age in which we're seeing democracy either sort of stalled or in retreat in any number of places around the world. And that matters for how we think about, what kinds of challenges surveillance might pose. I guess, the second thing I'll say is that I think it's really urgent, and this is to pick up on a point that was raised earlier, to have these conversations now. And particularly not to let things slide when the pandemic eases up and, we think, okay, we can go back to normal, right? The places that have dealt more effectively with the challenges posed by, the crisis, and in particular, the push that the crisis generated to use health surveillance are places that had been through it before. And in particular, I'm thinking about South Korea and Taiwan, right? And so Taiwan had experience with SARS, South Korea had a MERS outbreak in 2015. And after that, both countries, based on the experience they got from dealing with an infectious disease outbreak, went through a democratic process of saying, okay, if that happens again, what do we as a democracy, as a polity, want the response to look like? And so what they came up with is a little bit different in each case. But it put boundaries, right? It said, okay, we're not going to collect any more data than we think we have to. So we're going to make it proportional to the degree of emergency. We're going to limit the collection of information in both time and scope. Scope meaning, not everybody in the government got access to the data that was collected. It was very specific bureaucratic actors, and they were audited on a fairly regular basis to make sure that the use was appropriate for public health and public health alone. And then there are provisions that the data is going to be deleted at the end of the pandemic, or if the pandemic recedes. I forget exactly what the wording is in both cases, but there's a temporal limit on the use of and retention of the data. I mean, in Taiwan's case, there's actually an audit process to make sure that the data has been deleted. And so that the third piece, so it's proportional, it's limited in time and scope, and then surveillance has also been arrived at, like whatever the consensus has been, it's been arrived at through a democratic process. We know that one of the dangers for democratic backsliding, one of the dangers that can lead to autocratization is the use of emergency powers in state of emergency, right? That gives the executive a chance to say, I'm going to do X, and then they've got the power to do X, and that's awfully convenient, and they don't want to, people don't want to give it back later, and maybe it's their successor from another party doesn't want to give it back either. It's nice to have the power to get things done, and it's really hard to relinquish that, right? There's a reason why, America the Beautiful has that line about confirm thy soul in self-control. It's because it's hard to do. It's hard for government to do. And so, the idea is that the places that went through and arrived at these, limits on the use of surveillance through a democratic process. They were debated by a legislature that was elected and went through judicial review as well, right? And so that gives you both the sort of electoral check and the judicial rule of law check to say, okay, this is what we as a democracy have decided on. Now, I don't think every country is probably going to come to exactly the same result. The point is that people who have been, democratically selected should have the opportunity to debate these trade-offs in a transparent way and used the democratic tools or the tools of a democracy to arrive at a solution. And then you can revisit it and you can look at what other countries are doing. I don't imagine that, all of the democracies in the international system are going to come up with exactly the same set of trade-offs or the same mechanisms. But it seems to me that at least then, people will have had the opportunity to have had a voice in what information they're required to provide, and they won't be doing it under the pressure of an emergency, right? It's not truly a negotiation if there's a gun pointed at your head. And so this needs to be a matter of consent rather than people sort of feeling like I provide this information or I'm gonna end up dead, right? That really compromises the quality of democratic debate. And so I think that, that piece is really important. The other thing is that I think this, this does need to be a transparent process. That's part of when I say it was arrived at through a democratic mechanism, right? So one of the most interesting sort of ways of thinking about this I've heard is from Taiwan's digital minister, Audrey Tang, who has this saying about, surveillance makes the people legible to the government, and transparency has to be the flip side of that to make the government legible to people. Right. And so whatever the government is collecting, subject, you can't, that doesn't mean all the data that the government collects gets released to everybody, because that's exactly the privacy violation we don't want. Right. But the idea here is that there should be some transparency about what the government is seeing and what they're doing, so that citizens can decide when that constitutes overreach and abuse. Right. And the United States will probably have a different set point for that than the UK. We have on counterterrorism legislation. I would expect we will on public health. That's okay. The point is that, there's a democracy that gets to debate this and decide how to protect minority rights or minority views and implement the will of the majority. And we all know that those are in tension sometimes in democracy, but that's still fundamentally a democratic task. And so to me, where I see this headed in the next, 4, 5, 10 years is really different democracies around the globe, I hope, once the sort of emergency subsides, will use that as a springboard for really demonstrating how it is that democracies consider and do these decisions differently. That might be a pie in the sky dream, but that's like, if I'm outlining the objective for the United States, right, as a citizen of the United States, as well as somebody who looks at democracy globally, I want to see a real serious conversation about what these, technical and legal safeguards we can put in place are, and, how different countries are arriving at those decisions so that we can share lessons and best practices.
Very interesting. I mean, it's a very optimistic kind of cut at this. And I think it does highlight the light at the end of the tunnel that's possible in a very kind of mixed approach.
I'm not normally an optimist, so you may be the first person in a long time to tell me that.
I was when you were talking, I was thinking, oh wow, yes, there are opportunities and options and ways to do this in very differentiated ways, and that it made me feel hopeful. So
I just really worry that we're not going to have these conversations, because once the urgency subsides, it would be easy not to. But
absolutely, yeah. No, I think those are great points. And then one last pivot to Jennifer before we open it up to questions from the audience, where Cullen will start. You talked about the government surveilling, what you could read at the library, right, in this post 9/11 space. I remember that really clearly. The pace of change has been so dramatic from that period to this period. You talked about this previously. Like, how do you think? I mean, and you work in media and you work with technology, and Vox is a very tech savvy media company. So how do you think about this pace of change, the social media relationship to the pace of change, disinformation, and the future of the issues that we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here to be the pessimist. So all those nice feelings that you had, get ready to lose them. It's not so bad. But one thing I think that's actually really interesting that I wanted to touch on that Sheena mentioned, I'm really glad that you talked about the South Korea model, because I think there's actually a lesson there right now that we're seeing, which is, as you mentioned, they went through this kind of, conversation, this democratic process to figure out how to put these guardrails on. And yet, South Korea, during the pandemic very recently, had a quarantine app, one of these apps that are used to track people in quarantine, that came out and was extremely defective, and could have essentially allowed hackers to retrieve names, real-time location, and other details of people in quarantine, to change it so that it looked like people were violating quarantine when they weren't, etc. And again, this is a problem that happened despite the fact that they had all these conversations. And I think that speaks to the pace of what's happening, which is, again, you can have these guardrails, you can have these conversations, but I think you need to look at the technologies too themselves. We have a tendency to, and especially, as you go further west towards Silicon Valley, to have this kind of techno-utopian ideal of, the more technologically advanced we get, the better we're going to get at things. But I think anyone who's used Zoom or any system ever, any computer, your smartphone, knows that a lot of times technology just stops working and it's really just doesn't do what it was supposed to do. And I think that's something that we need to really take a look at, the technology itself, right? And this is something I think about a lot. You know, we often talk about technology as being kind of morally neutral, right? It's this thing that is, right? It exists, and where the morality and ethics and legislation and things like that come in, it's how you use it, who's using it, what purpose you're using it for, et cetera, right? But the technology itself, it's just a camera, right? It can be used to monitor dissent, and it can be used to make sure nobody's breaking into a storefront, right? But I think the problem with that is that we're increasingly, especially in just the last few years, coming to understand that that may not actually be the case. It may not actually be the case in some, and indeed many circumstances, that technology is actually morally neutral. I think there's a really good example here, AI and algorithms and racial bias, right? So there's a NIST study in 2019 that looked at all of these different facial recognition algorithms, and they found that there was evidence of racial bias in nearly 200 of them, which really makes you question, well, that's just the technology itself. We're not even getting to the question of who's using it. Is it a police department who's using this? Or, is it a government? Or, is it just, people using it to log into your cell phone? You're still at the technology point. And there are already problems that have, could potentially have serious knock-on effects in terms of, of equities, in terms of, reinforcing systemic biases. And so I think that's something that we really need to have these conversations going forward, that I think that needs to be raised, that we need to start earlier and really have the conversation about, who is creating this technology, what groups are being represented, whose perspectives are driving the creation of this technology before it's deployed, right? In the creation phase. What values and goals are being prioritized in the creation of this technology? Right? What trade-offs are we making? And I think, making sure that we have diverse voices, in all senses of that word, racial, gender, orientation, disability, right? You need to bring all sectors of society. If these technologies are going to be deployed on all sectors of society, then you need to make sure that those perspectives are being represented so that you don't have that already baked in before you even get to the questions of how to use this technology. And then on the disinformation kind of side of things, I think there's also a big question, and something that I'm really watching in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years, which is increasing algorithmic determinism, which is essentially when you get locked in this kind of self-reinforcing loop of past behaviors, past preferences being used to dictate and curate content from Netflix to Amazon to whom you follow on social media accounts, and creating these kind of environmental and media and communication bubbles. They can really lead you to increasingly become isolated in terms of the perspectives that you're hearing, in terms of reinforcing biases, reinforcing pre-existing opinions. And then I think the last thing really I would say is that regulation is a problem that I think we're going to be facing continually. I think we see any journalist, I can tell you, who's ever watched Congress hold a hearing on technology, can tell you it is quite literally one of the most embarrassing things to watch ever, because there just is in a lot of cases, there's just a fundamental lack of understanding of just the basics of what's happening. And you have to have that if you're going to even start to be able to figure it out, if you're providing adequate oversight and democratic kind of legislating to put these guardrails on. If you don't know how the car even works, then how do you put a guardrail up? So I think those are kind of the things that I really need to watch in the coming years.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, this is a really robust and fascinating discussion, and it has elicited a lot of questions from our audience. So we are going to have to go a little bit more rapid fire as we respond to these, but we are actually going to stay, I think, in the online or kind of digital domain, because Joe Rondon asked a question with vast security implications. So that we've been talking about this primarily as a discussion between the relationships between democratic citizens and their governments. But of course, we are seeing an increasing pivot in the security domain to concerns about cyber attacks and cybersecurity. And so I think the question is, how do we collect this critical data? How do we come up, we've already addressed, how do we come up with kind of the social compact around what will be collected? But then once we have it, how do we ensure that that is not going to become data that can be used by potential enemies or malfeasant actors who are not affiliated with any state in particular? Maybe let's go stay with Jen for a second, and then Sheena, you can tag that one.
Yeah, this is something I think a lot about too. When you're talking about, especially, foreign state actors, in particular China, and you look at some of the big hacks that have happened, right? You had, Marriott hotels, right? You have, that information. Well, okay, how much information is that really? Okay, you can tell who stayed at a hotel where and maybe what they got for room service, right? Well, then they hack, Humana or Aetna or one of the insurance companies. Well, then they have some information about maybe your son or daughter has a, disease that's going to cost a lot of money to treat. Well, what if they can put that together now with the data of where you travel and when, what your travel patterns are, and then maybe they hack OPM. They hack, the Office of Personnel Management in the U.S. government. So now they have a list of, all the people who work in critical areas of the government. Well, when you put all those things together, that creates a really pretty picture of someone, what they can access, what their vulnerabilities are, and where they're going to be. And that is really disturbing for, espionage, purposes, that you can potentially say, oh, okay, well, this person travels to these conferences. They're probably going to be there again. What if I just bump into them and, we start talking and I can mention that, oh, I know you have a lot of medical expenses. What if I just gave you some money and you gave me some information about your government, right? Collectively, I think we need to start thinking about the bigger picture of how state actors and others, right, non-state actors in particular, but the state actors are the ones that have the real heft, how they can put all that information together and use it collectively, and being able to put in place, the structures to make sure that people don't exploit that is really hard.
Yeah, I think that's a really good synopsis of one of the major concerns, which is just that, it's that information has been available, at least in part, to intelligence agencies before, but it's the speed with which a large amount of information can be integrated very quickly. I remember when I was researching my first book, looking at network diagrams that the Stasi had drawn, but drawing one person's sort of, social network might take a couple months. Of tracing contacts and working through things, and now downloading somebody's contacts on their phone and looking at call frequencies, you can get at least some semblance of a contact map very, very quickly. So I think recognizing the speed of that process, and that's an important process that could really accrue to the state's benefit. And again, when I look at this really in a global perspective. One of the real concerns that I have is that speed being applied to systems where there's a pretty high tolerance for a false positive rate, right? So, all algorithms have some trade-off between, would you rather have a false negative or a false positive, right? That's an inherent sort of question about what you ask the algorithm to do with what information. But the question really is, and there's been some really interesting writing on this. Jen Pan at Stanford has looked at this in her book on China. There's a book by my colleague, Sarah Brain here at UT, where she looks at the use of technologies like Palantir in the LAPD, and sort of the way that the use of particular algorithms has or amplifies political effects, right? But fundamentally, then there's also the option to course correct in a system where there's a democratic mechanism for feedback. And so I worry a lot about this in democracy and in the United States, where I live and am raising a family. But globally, I also think we have to realize that the potential for things to go even more badly awry is even higher in systems where the government might not care nearly as much about a false positive, right? Think about the issue that we've had in the United States with police violence around false positives, right? and then think about, does the Chinese government have the same sort of sensitivity to false positives when it's putting its Uyghur Muslim minority citizens in detention and re-education facilities? My guess would be no. I've seen some party documents that pretty explicitly suggest that the sensitivity to false positives is a lot lower there. And so I think, we have to think about what the interaction, I 100% agree with the point that you just have to focus on technology itself. But I also think there are different political systems that can either fence in or at least dampen down or amplify those effects, and recognizing that they're going to have differential political effects in different places is really important.
Thank you. There are a number of questions, so I'm going to try to weave together one question that I see that happens in a couple places, and it relates to incentives to sell data and the value of data, and whether, I don't know if it was articulated this way, but I'm really curious about your thoughts, and if we could start with Sheena, on the relationship between private sector technology development and the incentive behind that being the selling of the data, and what that amplifies in terms of the technology development that then can be used by authoritarian states. So how do you think about the relationship between private sector motivations, which we often think about from more of a democratic oriented perspective, and how that can then actually foster a more amplified tool set for authoritarian states? And there are other questions about the value of private data, and if that private data selling incentive is a really important piece of this puzzle.
Okay, I'll try to answer really quickly, and if I skip a step in my own logic, somebody catch me and I'll go back and explain it. I mean, first of all, I tend to be on the more sort of privacy cautious side of this. I have a running debate with my mother, who complains that I refuse to download Find Friends on my iPhone because I don't want, I just don't like it. And even though it's my mother checking, I would rather not sort of have that activated. But the point is that there's an opt-in, right? And I think that democracies probably need to move more toward a system. We know that defaults are important. You think about like the book Nudge, right? The Cass Sunstein volume where he talks about the importance of defaults. I think it would be wise, and it would still give people the choice, right? If they want to provide that information to a private company, great. But personally, I tend to favor moving more toward a situation where people have to opt in, and the default is an opt out for privacy protection and civil liberties reasons. And then I think we also need to think about it. Again, this is a case where the sort of the domestic politics and the global politics get really quickly intertwined. And so, for example, one of the reasons why I've been concerned about, say, for example, the executive order on TikTok is that TikTok wasn't really an issue until about this time last year, right? Very few people had heard of it. Very few people used it. It tended to spike. We're seeing kind of a similar dynamic, especially for those of us who work on China with Clubhouse. Not that the apps are the same, but just that apps kind of come and go in popularity. But the issue fundamentally of data exfiltration via market mechanisms, some of it's hacking, right? Jen gave a couple of really good examples, but there are also just cases where companies can then turn around and resell data, which I know one of the questions in the chat was asking about. And I think we need to look at how to regulate that, and whether people are opting into each stage of that process. I think people should basically, know whether they're signing their data over to anyone and everyone, including a, state data mining company in China with affiliations with the CCP, or, a company that's doing sort of purely market-based experiments elsewhere in the world or in America, right? But I think people, that chain of where information goes is important for people to understand. And again, that transparency is really the first step toward giving people back more control over where that information goes. And people can't make an informed, so I always think about the informed consent principle, right? It's not an experiment, but people generally should have the ability to participate in informed consent on where they're providing their information to. Again, that's much easier to say in theory than it is to administer in practice. But as I think about, private data, I think fundamentally the goal here should be, to try to give people as much ability to make that choice at as disaggregated and low level a level as possible, because people are going to have varying levels of preference and varying levels of comfort. And I think we need a political sort of regulatory environment that probably accommodates that variation and that diversity.
That's a great response, Sheena. And in the interest of kind of trying to answer as many questions as we can, I'm going to ask a targeted question to Jennifer here. And this comes from a former MA student at the Korbel School, Nick Lightfoot. In the UK, vaccine take-up has been notably lower among people of color and ethnic communities. That is true in the United States as well. How would you assess the benefit risk kind of calculus of using data technology to target public health messages to these groups? Does that play into any kind of existing concerns about government targeting of surveillance activities on marginalized communities to begin with?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Right, and again, I think you need to go back to kind of looking at how these technologies are created in the first place, and what they were meant to do, how they were designed. I think yes, it's useful in some cases to do micro-targeting, right? That's the use, the point of this data collection is to be able to do micro-targeting. And so obviously one public health benefit ideally would be to be able to target specific communities, even if it's just in terms of language access, right? And making sure that you were getting the messaging out. At the same time, I go back to that point about techno-utopianism and the idea that technology is going to solve this. A lot of what we see, and I've done a lot of work, and my team at Vox has done a lot of great reporting on this. I'm looking globally at how public messaging about COVID and about vaccination has been done. In Senegal, for example, a lot of it was just community buy-in, literally getting the public health officials in the same room as tribal leaders, as trusted members of these communities, and having them kind of bought into the system and getting them to be the ambassadors to their own community. So I think having, personal human representation and having trust and building trust, because, marginalized communities obviously have a lot of reasons to distrust, public messaging, because they have been used as guinea pigs literally for studies when it comes to public health, and are, routinely discriminated against in terms of public health, provision. So I think, making sure that you have a human involved somewhere, and that, there are communities that are being kind of brought in rather than targeted at, I think is a better way of looking at it, right? Bringing people in, making sure that we are reaching out and getting community buy-in rather than just kind of shooting laser messages at people scattershot and hoping that they land. I think that's kind of where I would come down on that.
Thank you. That's a fascinating insight. Folks, unfortunately, our time together is drawing short. This has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we could have gotten to more of these questions. But this is a debate that that existed before the COVID pandemic. It is one that is going to be with us, I think, in perpetuity. Jennifer, Sheena, thank you so much for your insights into this issue. Thanks to my co-host, Jonathan. We hope you have a great rest of your summit, Summiteers. Go forth, learn, and discuss.
Thank you all.